To have Dr. Yiding Feng here to talk about his recent work. So Yiding he got his PhD from Northwestern University, and he did a postdoc in Microsoft Research, and now currently he's a postdoc in University of Chicago, and he's going to join Hong Kong UST in the next year. So yeah, so Yiding, please, the mic is yours. Can start.
So thank you. So hello everyone, so welcome to my talk, and thanks for the kind introduction. So today I would like to talk about strategic budget selection in a competitive auto bidding world. And this is joint work with my amazing collaborator, Brandon Lucier and Alex Sifsins. Both of them are the researchers at Microsoft Research. So this is still ongoing work, and this is my first time giving this talk. So if you have any question or need clarification, please feel free to interrupt me and ask your question. Okay, let's get started. So this work is motivated from the application in the digital advertising market. So in the beginning of the talk, I would like to provide some background for the digital advertising market. So from this slide, you can see the annual revenue of two well-known companies, Google and Meta, which is also formerly known as Facebook. So as you can see, in the last 2 decades, so the annual revenue of those two companies increased a lot. And here I would like to highlight that the majority of the revenue for those two companies are actually coming from their advertising service. And there are many types of advertising service, and one classic one is called sponsor search. And I would expect that every one of us have the experience. Imagine that we are searching some keywords on a search engine or social media. For example, if we search China MBA on Google. So here is a screenshot of the results. As you can see, here there are 4 websites, and in all websites they have this label called sponsor, indicating that it is actually an advertisement. As you can see, the first is coming from MBA.com, so it is a company. The second one is UChicago. The third one is CEBIS, 中欧商学院, and the last one is Shanghai Jiao Tong University. And so one question we can ask is that, so once a search query appears, how does a platform like Google decide whose advertisement to be displayed? And how does Google charge them for the payment? And what behind this kind of sponsor search is the so-called sponsor search auction implemented by the platform like Google. So at a very high level, so what's happening here is that so Google will have a pool of advertisers, which correspond to different type of company, different type of university. And whenever a user submits a search query, for example, they search China MBA, Google will implement it at auction, where the relevant advertiser will decide a bid to this auction. And then given the whole bid profile submitted by the advertiser, the platform will decide whose advertisement to be displayed and how much they will be charged. And as you can see from the advertiser's perspective, so how to decide a bid is actually a challenging task. And this is because all those search queries appears in the platform in an online fashion. And therefore, so all those auctions are implemented through an online fashion. And more importantly, so different search queries may contain different keywords, and they may be searched by different user characteristics. And because of that, from the advertiser's perspective, how to optimally decide their bids for each auction in this real-time fashion is fairly complicated. And in the past, there are actually third-party companies which help the advertiser to decide their bidding strategy. And here, in the recent year, thanks to the great progress in our machine learning literature, so this kind of platform started using this new technology called automated bidding. On the left-hand side, you can see a screenshot of a news article which is talking about Google implementing this auto bidding system on their platform. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Google's own explanation of this auto bidding technology to their user. So at a high level, so what's happening here is that so Google creates this middle ground layer, which we call the auto bidder. And auto bidder are provided by the platform like Google, where each advertiser will be equipped with her own auto bidder. And nowadays, what advertisers need to do is no longer to decide their bid. They just to input some very simple instruction to their auto bidder. For example, what is their budget they want to spend within a time cycle, for example, a week? And what is the maximum bid the auto bidder can submit for their advertiser? And then for each auto bidder, so they will try to follow the instruction given by their own advertiser and try to decide how to bid for each auction separately as a proxy for their advertiser. Just to have a quick summary, so because of this new revolution of in the industry where industry start to introducing the auto bidder, so we have this kind of three layer structure as a new paradigms. The first layer is the advertiser, where they will impose a simple instruction to the auto bidder, and then auto bidder will decide the bid for each of the auction. And just provide a little bit more background for this kind of new paradigms. Nowadays, for the company like Google or Microsoft, all the advertising traffic need to go through this auto bidder layer, meaning that the advertiser can no longer decide their bid for each search query individually. They must use this auto bidding interface. And as you can imagine, because of this new revolution in the industry, there must be a bunch of research in the academia which study these new paradigms. And in particular, there are lots of studies which study the interaction between the second and third layer, in particular, the interaction between the auto bidder and the auction. For example, how should we design better auto bidder algorithm? And because auto bidder decide their bid and competing against each other in a real-time fashion, how should we analyze the dynamic of those auto bidder? And here I would like to highlight that a majority of those work try to view the auto bidder and their corresponding advertiser as the same identity. So in other words, they do not distinguish between the first and the second layer. And the starting point of our work is trying to say that, okay, this view where we consider the advertiser and their auto bidder as the same identity may be a little bit questionable. And this is because that what we observe in the reality from the data is that those advertisers will actually frequently adjust their instruction they give into the auto bidder. This is kind of like suggesting that this advertiser are actually treating those instructions as some knob which they can do fine-tuning. In other words, the advertiser actually strategically responds to those auto bidder. Or equivalently, we can think from the advertiser's perspective, they are actually nowadays, they are actually interacting with a more cohesive mechanism, which is a combination of the original auction combining with their auto bidder. And the motivation of our work and this talk is that we try to model this kind of strategic behavior of the advertiser, where they try to use their own auto bidder to competing against each other. And we want to understand what will be the impact on the market efficiency. And let me pause here a little bit to see if any question.
So in your picture, you have auto bidder.
Yeah.
I suppose the auto bidder should be the same for every user, correct? And your the right most one is looks slightly different from the others. Do you differentiate on purpose?
Yes, that's a good question. So for this talk, for simplicity, you can assume that all the auto bidder, they are the same type of, so they are the same algorithm. Okay. Or more precisely, you could imagine that they are a broad class of algorithm which will guarantee the no regret assumption.
I see.
And the main differences between them is basically the instruction given by the advertiser.
Okay. Yes.
Cool. So here, let me give you a quick summary of what what's the results we will talk about today. So first, we will introduce this game theoretical model to help us to understand this competition of the advertiser, where each advertiser will use their own auto bidder to do the bidding. And here, I would like to highlight 2 points. The first point is that in our model, so there will be a misalignment between the advertiser and the auto bidder. In other words, we can no longer view them as the same identity. And this misalignment mainly comes from the fact that we are allowing advertisers to have very complicated preference, but the auto bidder are very naive, and they can only be controlled by simple instruction. And we will observe that because of this misalignment, so many observations people have established by studying the competition across auto bidder will fail when we actually reasoning about the competition between the advertiser. On the other side, we will see that even though there exists such a misalignment, the market efficiency will still be approximately optimal under some mild assumption on the preference of the advertiser. And finally, we will, from a system design perspective, we will see that in order to achieve a good market efficiency, the instruction where the advertiser can specify the budget will be more important than they can specify, for example, the maximum bid. And here is the outline of the remaining talk. So first, I will talk about our new model, which tries to understand the competition of advertiser. And because we think the main contribution of this work is trying to introduce in this model. So in this talk, I will put most of my time focusing on introducing this model, and we will go through some examples to enhance our understanding. And then I will briefly talk about our market efficiency analysis. And finally, we will go to the conclusion. And again, let me stop here to see if I have any question about the summary of our results. Okay, let's move on. So just a reminder, so in this new paradigm for the digital advertising, so we have this three layer: advertiser, auto bidder, and the auction. And to introducing our model, I would like to first focus on the advertiser we considered. In particular, imagine that there will be T round, where each round a search query will appear, and it will create some opportunity for that platform to display ads. And in the industry, this will be called the ad impression. So basically, you can interpret as, so it will correspond to the ad slot where the platform would like to allocate. And we will assume that there will be an advertiser. And we will assume each advertiser will have some separable preference, which will be specified as follows. So imagine that we are given the allocation, which you can interpret as what is the probability or fraction of ad slot it will be allocated to this advertiser for each impression, and what will be the payment he will be paid. Then the advertiser's utility will have two parts. The first part is her valuation by given the allocation, and the second part is this utility for the payment. And in particular, here this variable phi it will correspond to the conversion rate. So loosely speaking, you can interpret it as what will be the probability that once this ad slot has been allocated to this advertiser, what will be the probability that a click will happen? Or let's say on Taobao, it will be what will be the probability that actually a purchase will happen? And the advertiser's utility valuation will be the value for example, the number of clicks they receive, or let's say the number of purchases they happen depending on the application. And in this talk, we will mainly assuming that this valuation, let's say for the click, will be concave, meaning that it will have a decreasing marginal gain, meaning that the more click we have, the lower additional value we can gain. And for the second part, it is a disutility for spending money. It is basically, we will assuming this will be a convex function. So this disutility, you can interpret it as, for example, there will be a budget constraint, or let's say they can also incorporate the outside option for the advertiser. Imagine that suppose the advertiser doesn't spend this money on the platform like Google. What happens if he shift those money to the other platform like Microsoft? What will be the utility they can create by shifting those money as an outside option? So we will reminder. So we will assume this valuation function will be concave, and the disutility for spending money will be convex. And we do not assume any additional structure on those two functions. And so our preference model can capture some very classic preference, for example, the linear preference, where the marginal gain is always linear, where in other words, the valuation function will be a linear function with slope vi. So basically here, the small vi, you can interpret it as the value per click. And the disutility for spending money is basically the identity function. And another classic preference we can also recover is the budgeted preference, which has been studied extensively in the auto bidding literature. Basically, the valuation function is still linear, and this utility for spending money is still identity function up to a budget constraint bi. And if the payment exceeds bi, the DCUT will be infinite. In other words, the advertiser's utility will be negative infinite. Basically means that the advertiser never wants to exceed her hard budget constraint, capital BI. Once again, let me pause here to see if you have any question about the preference of the advertiser.
So the first term VI does not depend on PI.
The first term VI does not depend on the payment PI, yes.
Okay, so it's like I spend, like if I spend 0 versus I spend a lot, it does not affect the valuation. It's just, I see.
Yeah, it does not, yeah, that's a very good point. So it does not impact my valuation, but it will impact my utility.
Okay, I see.
Cool. Cool. So now we have introducing our assumption for the advertiser. Next, I would like to talk about the Autobidder and their interaction with the auction. So in this work, we will assume that those impressions, in other words, search query or let's say ad slot, so they will be sold to the advertiser by a classic auction called the first price auction. And basically, what's happening here is that for each ad slot, for each impression, the Autobidder will specify a bid for this ad slot, and then the Autobidder with the highest bid will receive the impression. And if there are multiple Autobidder with the same highest bid, then we need to implement a tie-breaking rule. And for this talk, you can assume that this tie-breaking rule will be uniform and random. But our results does not rely on the tie-breaking rule, and it will hold for an arbitrary tie-breaking rule. And finally, the payment will basically be computed by so-called first price payment method. Basically, the payment equals to your bid times the fraction, or let's say the probability that you will win this impression. And as I mentioned earlier, so each advertiser will be equipped with her own Autobidder, where the Autobidder will get an instruction of budget and the maximum bid, VI. And the goal of each Autobidder is to decide their bid for each first price auction, such that this Autobidder wants to maximize the total number of clicks they receive, subject to 2 constraints. The first constraint is a budget constraint. The total payment cannot exceed this budget specified by her own advertiser. And the second constraint is called the maximum bid constraint. In the industry, it is also called the return of the spend, ROS constraint. It basically says that this BI cannot exceed this VI times 580, where VI is specified by the advertiser. So equivalent speaking, you can interpret this Autobidder as a player who has a linear preference, such as, so this VI you can interpret as her value, and so basically the advertiser never wants to submit a bid which higher than her value for this impression, and he or she also have a budget constraint. And another thing I would like to highlight is that this program is actually a little bit complicated. This is because that. So here the variable is a budget. So the variable is a bid, and the allocation and the payment will not only depend on this own Autobidder's bid, but will also depend on the other Autobidder's bid, and the bid also need to decide in a real-time fashion. So actually, what the Autobidder will do is actually they will implementing some no-regret learning algorithm where they will competing against this benchmark. Just to try to make it more formal. So here I would like to try to introduce an important notion which is called the first price pacing equilibrium. It is basically introduced in the literature, and it is used to model the competition across Autobidder in the first price auction. And the formal definition is as follows. But before we dive into the formal definition, I would like to first talk about why this notion is important. So basically it has been shown that for a large class of Autobidder, if they are using some no-regret learning algorithm, then the outcome of the competition of the Autobidder will converge to this notion of first price pacing equilibrium. And from a theoretical point of view, first price pacing equilibrium also admits many beautiful theoretical properties, For example, the first price pacing equilibrium FPP always exists, and it is actually unique. Okay, now I hope that I have convinced you that this is an important notion, which we can spend a little bit more time to fully understand this notion. So imagine that we have a bunch of auto bidder, and their instruction is their budget, and as well as their maximum bid. Then this FPP is a profile of the so-called pacing multiplier, alpha 1 to alpha n, where for each auto bidder, basically what he or she will do is to set her bid equals to her value for this impression, for this S slot, scaled down by this alpha I. And the corresponding allocation and payment will be basically computed in the first price fashion. So basically what's happening here is that we can imagine that, so for each impression, for each S slot, so we can consider there is a price which equals to the highest bid across all auto bidder. And the auto bidder can only win a positive fraction of this S slot if and only if her bid equals to this price, in other words, is the highest. And the payment is equals to this price times her allocation. And on the right-hand side, the first two constraints basically the constraints the auto bidder need to satisfy. The first constraint is that the budget constraint. The total payment he has been charged in the first price auction cannot exceed her budget constraint. And the second constraint is basically the maximum bid constraint. And this is because that we're assuming that her bid is equals to her value for this impression scaled down by alpha I. And therefore, if alpha I is smaller or equals to 1, the maximum bid is satisfied. And finally, the last constraint is also a very important constraint. It is called the no unnecessary pacing. It is basically say that either the budget constraint is binding or the maximum bid constraint is binding. So one of those two constraints must be binding. And this is a property we need to be satisfied for the first price pacing equilibrium. And at a high level, this will guarantee the uniqueness of this solution concept. So let me pause here a little bit to see if any question about this important concept.
So it's defined with respect to a set of budget where add the max valuation.
Yeah, so
it's like if the user changes his mind about these parameters, then this equally like this FPP should also change.
Yes, so if we change the VI, the FPP will change.
Yeah.
The allocation will also change. Mm-hmm. But it's guaranteed that it always exists and it is unique.
I see.
Cool. Any other question? Cool, so because this is a really important concept, so I would like to go through two examples to ensure that we fully understand it. So let's first consider a very tall example where we just have two auto bidder and a single impression, such as the value is 1 and 0.7, and they have no budget constraint. They can spend as much as they want, and the conversion rate is 1. In this case, because we know FPP always exists and unique, so the pacing multiplier will actually all equals to 1, and therefore the bid of the two auto bidder will be 1 and 0.7, and therefore the highest bid is 1 and the price becomes 1, and auto bidder 1 receives the whole impression and pays the price which equals to 1. And in other words, so for this example, I would like to highlight that this allocation in the FP is efficient because the impression goes to the auto bidder with a higher value. Cool. So now let's try to go through another slightly more complicated example. Suppose we have two auto bidder and two impression. And now those auto bidder have the same value and the same budget. But now let's assume that the impression is set such that auto bidder 1 prefer impression 1 and auto bidder 2 prefer impression 2. And in this toy example, the FPP will be the case where the pacing multiplier will be 0.7, such that for both auto bidder, so they will submit a bid which is they will submit a bid which equals to 0.5 for their preferred impression and a quarter for their less preferred impression. And therefore the price will be 0.5 for both impression, and each auto bidder received her favored impression. And therefore, for this toy example, the outcome of FPP is still efficient. Cool. So if we have no more question about this solution of FPP, now we are ready to describe our main model. So our model will be named as metagame of strategic budget selection. Basically, what's happening here is that each advertiser will strategically decide their instruction, the budget, and the maximum bid to their own auto bidder. And then the outcome, the allocation and payment will be determined by this FPB, assuming that the auto bidder follows the instruction specified by those advertisers. And we will call this competition across the auto bidder as inner FPB, and the competition across the advertiser as a metagame. And we will consider two classic solution concepts in this metagame, which is a pure Nash equilibrium and a mixed Nash equilibrium. And basically, a Nash equilibrium says that given the instruction of other advertiser in the equilibrium, so my instruction in the equilibrium is the best response against the other advertiser. And pure means that all the instructions are deterministic, and mixed means that the instruction can be randomized. So pause here to see if you have any question about our model.
I have a question. I wonder if every advertisers report their Phi-ij to the auto bidder.
VIJ or Phi-ij?
Yeah.
Phi-ij, good. So we will assume that Phi-ij is public information, which is fixed. So they are not allowed to decide the Phi-ij.
Oh, thanks.
Any other question?
I have a small question, but regarding the last page. So, yeah, just one. Okay, here. So I'm not sure does the BG19 paper show that the auto bidders with actually in first price auctions the dynamic conversion to FPPE, because I remember that their work they suggest that in the second price auction. Okay, so they do the dynamic pacing and then they converge to the, like, I would say, second price pacing equilibrium, but they are working in a stochastic environment rather than the fixed value environment. So I'm not sure whether this is much correct here.
Yeah, so you are absolutely correct. So here I'm a little bit imprecise. So you are absolutely correct. So here I'm let it be a little bit imprecise, but so we are able to show that under some condition. So we can also observe that there will be convergence of, let's say, for example, the budget pacing algorithm, which will converge to the FPP.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I have a question. In your definition of first price pacing equilibrium, since there is an equilibrium in such definition, so I'm wondering whether the multiplier of each bidder should be the best response of others, just like Nash equilibrium.
That is also a very good question. So you can actually interpret this alpha I as a best response in the sense that, so basically, as we discussed here, so the main goal of each auto bidder is to maximize the value they receive. So they maximize the number of clicks they receive subject to their budget constraint and the ROI constraint. So first, let's assume that we ignore the ROI constraint, mainly consider the budget constraint. Then basically the pacing multiplier is basically the Lagrangian multiplier if we Lagrange the budget constraint into the objective. And in other words, so basically you can interpret this pacing multiplier. You can interpret this pacing multiplier as basically the optimal Lagrangian dual, assuming that each auto bidder is doing a value maximization subject to their budget constraint.
So you mean such multiplier is not only the Lagrangian dual, but also the best response to each other.
Yes, and here, so one thing I would like to emphasize is that, so here the best response is considering the auto bidder just want to maximizing the value subject to budget constraint, instead of maximize the utility which is a value minus a payment subject to a budget constraint. And this is actually the main, so one of the main reasons that we have this misalignment between advertiser and auto bidder, because advertiser want to do utility maximization, meaning that they care about how much they pay. But for the auto bidder's goal, they only care about how many clicks they receive. They don't care about how much they spend, as long as their total spend is below the budget. And if we define the best response according to the auto bidder's preference, their goal, then it will be the best response. But it may not be the best response for the advertiser who are doing utility maximization. So as I promised, because we think the main contribution of this work is the model, so I would like to revisit our two examples which we have been considered when we consider the autobidding, the competition of course auto bidder. Now let's try to assume that they are actually the parameter associated with the advertiser. And what we'll observe is that, so the observation we have before for the auto bidder will no longer hold for the competition across advertiser. Specifically, here let's consider that we have two advertisers, single impression. Advertiser has a linear preference at 1 and 0.7, and the impression we have conversion rate 1 for both advertisers. And in this toy example, we are able to show that there actually exists two pure Nash equilibrium in our metagame. Remember that for the competition across auto bidder, we know the FPB is unique. So which is different here, we have two pure Nash equilibrium. So in the first pure Nash equilibrium, they will specify a budget constraint, which equals to 0.7 for both auto bidder, and their maximum value is 1 and 0.7. And then in the inner FPB, the pacing multiplier will be basically 0.7 and 1. And in other words, each auto bidder will submit a bid which equals to 0.7, and the auto bidder 1 will win the whole impression. In other words, the advertiser 1 will win the whole impression. And here I would like to highlight that even though both auto bidder submit the same bid, the reason that advertiser 1 wins the whole impression is because of the definition of the first price pacing equilibrium. Because we have the constraint called no unnecessary pacing, meaning that either the budget constraint to binding or the maximum bid need to binding. Because for advertiser 1, the pacing multiplier is 0.7, meaning that the maximum bid constraint doesn't bind. In other words, the budget constraint must be binding. In other words, advertiser 1 must spend all her budget. And because the price is 0.7 and her budget is 0.7, so he must win the whole impression. But still, so this equilibrium, even though it is a little bit complicated, it is still good because it is efficient. In other words, impression goes to an advertiser with higher value. But unfortunately, there also exists another equilibrium where so it is no longer efficient. Let's define gamma to be a function depending on the difference between V1 and V2. And basically, in the second equilibrium, what will happen is that each advertiser will set her budget equals to gamma times her true value and set the maximum bid to be their true value. And then in the inner FPP, the pacing multiplier will basically be gamma for both auto bidder. And the per unit price will be the summation of the budget of two auto bidder. And each advertiser in the end, so basically win a fraction of this impression proportion to their value. And the takeaway is that, so we know that this allocation of this metagame may not necessarily to be efficient. But for the original example, if those VI are associated with the auto bidder, so we know the FP always exists, and for this example, it is efficient. Cool. So for this example, I would like to dive into a little bit more detail to see what's happening behind this competition across auto bidder as an advertiser. Let's imagine that we fix in advertiser 2's instruction to be B2 tilde and V2 tilde. And let's assume that advertiser 1 sets their maximum bid to be infinite. In other words, there is no maximum bid constraint. And let's assume that advertiser 1 will adjust so the budget they declare to their auto bidder. And let's try to reason about what will be the bid of the auto bidder and what will be the per unit price. So what's happening here is that when the declared budget for advertiser 1 is small, in particular smaller than V2 minus B2. So both autobidders bid will basically be the summation of the budget of those two autobidders. In other words, even though the advertiser 1 increasing her budget, what will happen in the competition across autobidder is that the autobidder 2 for advertiser 2 will also increase her bid. And in other words, so there will exist a downstream effect on the per unit price, which will be equals to B1 plus B2. And here the dashed curve is the allocation rule, and the red curve is basically the per unit price, which we wrote here. And here basically for both autobidder, their budget constraint is binding. And in other words, their pacing multiplier is strictly smaller than 1. And then when the budget of the autobidder 1 continue to increase to this region, so what will happen is that for autobidder 2, her maximum bid constraint needs to binding. In other words, he can no longer to increase her bid. And at that time, so autobidder 1 will also set her bid equals to V2 hat, but and the price will still be the same. But because the budget for advertiser 1 increases and her budget constraint is binding, so her allocation will continue to increase, but the price will be stay in a flat fashion. And finally, if the budget continue to increase for autobidder 1, so what happens is that so autobidder 2 can, because her maximum bid constraint is already binding, he can no longer increasing her bid, and therefore so the autobidder 2 will start to lose the impression, and the price will be continue to increase, which equals to the budget of the autobidder 1, and the allocation will becomes always equals to 1, but the advertiser needs to pay a higher price. And then if we can draw the utility of the advertiser, what will happen is that because of they have this kind of three-phase transition, so we will observe that the utility of the advertiser will not be single peak. It will have a two peak. And so if we set B2 and V2 to be the assignment in their equilibrium, we specify in the last page. So the optimal solution for the for advertiser 1 is at this point, which is equilibrium, or which is a assignment of the second equilibrium we observe, which is inefficient. Any question about this example?
I have a question. So what about B2 tilde is larger than B2?
B2
tilde.
Yeah, B2 tilde. What happens is B2 tilde is larger than V2.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So here we are assuming that B2 tilde is smaller than V2, and if B2 tilde is larger than V2, so what will happen is that so what will happen is that for autobidder 2, so her budget constraint will never be binding. Her maximum bid constraint will always binding.
So there are only one phase transition.
There will be only so this part of phase transition will be degenerated.
Oh,
yeah. So that's right. Yes. Cool. Now let's try to work through another example. So we have two advertisers. They have budget preference, and their value and budget are all the same. Two impression. Again, advertiser 1 prefer impression 1, and advertiser 2 prefer impression 2. And what will happen here is that actually for this example, we can show that there exists no pure Nash equilibrium. And remember that when we consider competition across autobidder in the first price pacing equilibrium FPP, the FPP always exists. But here we can show that for the competition across advertiser, there doesn't exist pure Nash. And for this example, note that so advertiser's preference can be fully captured by their instruction, the budget and the maximum bid. But even in this case, so because the pure Nash doesn't exist, meaning that so revealing their preference truthfully is not the best response for the advertiser. And the intuition behind this example is basically this misalignment between the advertiser who actually do utility maximization, but their autobidder do value maximization. In other words, if we fix the number of clicks they receive, advertiser will prefer to pay as least as possible, but the autobidder doesn't care about how much they pay as long as the budget constraint is satisfied. So this will conclude the first part of my talk, which is introducing this new model to consider competition across advertiser. And let me know if you have any question about this part. Okay, so just to have a quick summary, what we'll observe is that when we consider this competition across advertiser, many observations we have seen for the competition across Autobidder is no longer hold. For example, the FPP is always EGS and is unique, but through two toy example, we see that the pure Nash of the advertiser may not be unique, and there might exist multiple pure Nash equilibrium. So both of them kind of like bad news. But next, we will try to say that so there are still some good news in the sense that the market efficiency is still good. But to illustrate this result, I need to first introduce this notion for us to measure the efficiency of the market. Here we will use a notion which we call the liquid wafer. It is defined for a given allocation. Basically, this definition is that it will be a summation of the willingness to pay for each advertiser given her allocation, which depends on her valuation function and the cost function. Let's try to work through a geographical illustration. Imagine that this point is the number of clicks the advertiser receives. And then this advertiser's willingness to pay is basically this point. And of course, so our liquid wafer, so for some classic preference, our liquid wafer will recover some classic notion. For example, if the advertiser has linear preference, then the willingness to pay is basically will equal to her value, so her valuation, and the liquid wafer will recover the standard wafer notion. And for the budget preference, the liquid wafer is basically her value capped by the budget. And this liquid wafer, which has been extensively studied in the computer science literature, is also known as compensating variation in the microeconomics. Any question about this notion of liquid wafer?
So here it seems that you need to assume CI is inversible. And the CI, if I remember correctly, is a convex function.
It is a convex function, yes.
And inversible.
For simplicity, at this point, let's assume that it is in. So we will assume that CI is actually convex and weakly increasing.
Weakly increasing, I see.
Let's say it is strictly increasing. So.
I see.
So to solve WI, we just set the utility to 0 and to solve the PI, is that right?
So, yeah, so to compute the willingness to pay?
Yeah.
So
the WI satisfies that utility is 0.
Yes. So yes. So if given this allocation xi, and if we set the payment to be her willingness to pay, then her utility will be 0. Exactly.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, exactly. And so basically compensating variation says that if I want to change the allocation, suppose your original allocation is xi. Yeah. So if I take it back from you, how much I need to compensate you?
Okay.
And this is basically why they call the compensating variation. Cool. So here is our main results for the market efficiency. So we can show that as long as our advertiser's preference has concave valuation, convex this utility for spending money, then for any pure Nash equilibrium, the induced allocation will have a liquid wafer, which is at least 50% of the optimal liquid wafer across all possible allocation. And we can show that this approximation ratio is tight, meaning that there exists some problem instance such as it is exactly equals to 2. And the caveat here is that, as we see from previous examples, the pure Nash equilibrium may not exist in our metagame. On the other side, we are able to show that if we consider mixed Nash equilibrium, which always exists for our metagame, so the allocation will be, the liquid wafer of the allocation in the mixed Nash will at least be a quarter of the optimal liquid wafer. And this result can be extended to more general setting in a Bayesian setting where the evaluation, this utility for spending money can be the private type of the advertiser, which can be drawn from some commonly known distribution. And the takeaway message here is that even if we allow advertiser to have much more complicated preference compared to the auto bidder, but just ask them to specify a budget constraint and the maximum bid constraint to the auto bidder, we can still achieve good market efficiency, a good market outcome. Again, let me know if you have a question about those results.
Yeah. So do we have a upper bound result for the theorem too?
So definitely, the upper bound for pure Nash, the 2, is still upper bound for the mixed Nash. But so we do not have a better upper bound for the mixed Nash. That will be an interesting question if we can close this gap between 2 and 4 for mixed Nash. And we can also show that for some specific preference, like budget preference, actually we can improve this 1/4 to 1/1 plus the golden ratio. So roughly 1/2.618. Cool. So because I'm a theoretician, so I would like to use one slide to give you some taste of how we prove the results. But let's just assuming that we are considering a very simple instance where we just have single impression and all advertiser has budget preference. Here, let me remind you, for the budget preference, the valuation is linear, the disutility is identity up to the budget constraint, and the willingness to pay is her value capped by the budget. And to show the results, we need to use the following technical lemma, which says that given any pure Nash equilibrium, if this advertiser doesn't exhaust her budget, then we have a lower bound on her allocation in the equilibrium, which will be 1 minus P over VI. P is the per unit price, and VI is her value. And we can show this lemma by saying that if this inequality is not satisfied, then this advertiser can increase her budget declared to the auto bidder a little bit, which will increase her utility. And the reason that we need to assume that they did not exist in her budget is because we want to increase her declared budget. And once we have this lemma, we are able to show the 2 approximation in the pure Nash. Let's set X star to be the optimal liquid welfare allocation. Consider 2 cases. If advertiser 1 exhausts her budget, then we know that in the allocation, her willingness to pay is equal to her budget, which is trivially upper bound her willingness to pay in the optimal allocation X star. And otherwise, if her doesn't exhaust her budget, we would like to invoke this lemma. First, we can show that her willingness to pay in the equilibrium is upper bounded by her willingness to pay in the optimal allocation minus her difference in the valuation. And then we can invoke the lemma by replacing VI with P and 1/xi. And by algebra, we see that the term on this inequality is minimized at xi equals to 0. And then combining all pieces together, we know that the optimal liquid welfare is upper bounded by the optimal liquid welfare in the equilibrium plus the total payment, where the total payment is trivially upper bounded by the liquid welfare. And therefore, we get these 2 approximations for this toy example of single impression and budget preference. Any question? Cool. So now we have the last part which I want to share in this talk. So far we have seen that if we consider the competition across the advertiser, even if they have complicated preference, the market outcome is still good. Now we want to ask the following question. Suppose we want to further simplify the instruction the advertiser can specify for the auto bidder. What type of instruction is still necessary and crucial? And to consider this question, we consider 2 variants of our model. So in one model, so advertiser can only specify their budget and cannot impose their maximum bid constraint. And for the other variant, it is vice versa. And here we can show this distinction that if the advertiser can specify the budget and remove the maximum bid constraint, then all our approximation results for the market efficiency still preserve. In contrast, if the advertiser can only specify the maximum bid, they cannot declare the budget, we can show that there exists some problem instance, such as the approximation of the Bayesian Nash equilibrium will be as bad as omega n, where N is the number of advertisers. And this is kind of suggesting that from system design's point of view, if we care about the market efficiency, allowing advertiser to specify their budget is more important than allowing the advertiser to specify the maximum bid. In other words, the ROS constraint. Cool. So this finished the market efficiency part. Let me know if you have any question.
So it seems that you are saying this max bid is not really necessary if you care about this approximation. Then I mean, what about the practical implications? For instance, did you really try to remove this and try to see whether the system performs well or not, or something like that?
Yeah, so I think that is definitely, so try to do some field experiments in the real data would definitely be something which can be, which could be done in the future research. But I would like to say that this message, so these results also align with what we observe from the data, in the sense that the budget constraint will be adjusted more frequently comparing to the constraint like ROS.
I see.
In other words, advertisers seems to be more sensitive to the budget they specified.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Cool. So just to have a quick summary. So in this work, we try to understand the competition across advertisers who are using Autobidder to do the competition. And we're introducing this new metagame of strategic budget selection. And here we allow advertiser to have a general preference, where the Autobidder only be controlled by simple instruction. And to capture the competition across Autobidder, we use this seminal concept of first price pacing equilibrium. And we observe that the observation established in the literature for the competition across Autobidder may fail when we consider the competition across advertiser because of this misalignment. But on the other side, we're able to show that even though there is a misalignment, the market efficiency is still preserved, and budget is more important than the maximum bid. Just want to highlight some potential future question. The first question we can ask is what happens if we no longer consider first price auction? For example, what happens if we consider second price auction? And here there is a challenge that the inner game, the competition across Autobidder, may not converge to a unique outcome. So in the literature, people have introduced a similar concept like second price pacing equilibrium. But for second price pacing equilibrium, it is not necessarily unique, and actually it is NP hard to compute. In contrast, for the first price pacing equilibrium, it can be formulated as convex program and solved in polynomial time. And the second question is that, so in this work, we're assuming that, we simplify the competition of course Autobidder as the pacing equilibrium, which is a convergence point of the dynamic of Autobidder. I think in reality, a more practical model is to assuming that Autobidder are also competing against in a dynamic. And how to incorporate this into the model is another interesting question. And finally, more broadly, I think because of nowadays people have started to make their decision or in their daily life using the support of different type of learning algorithm, for example, ChatGPT. And how should we reason about the competition across the player when they are using this kind of AI technology? And that's the conclude of my talk. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you so much for the nice talk. So do we have more questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'm first interested in the computation issue of the, let's say, the mixed Nash equilibrium of your metagame. So do you have any conclusions on this part?
So you mean, is it possible that we can compute the mixed Nash equilibrium?
Yeah, for example, in polynomial time, or if it is PBAD hard or something.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So at this point, we don't have the solution. So even for the pure Nash. Yeah, but so I think that definitely can be another follow-up work. And here I would like to highlight that. So for our game, so there are some nice property of the equilibrium. So for example, we are able to show that the best response function. So in other words, fixing the instruction of other advertiser. For this advertiser, utility as a function of, for example, her declared budget. So this utility curve we have some nice property like smoothness or the continuous.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? All right, so let's start Yiding again for the last one.
Yeah, thanks everyone.